"This is your last chance, Sergeant Harris," the German intelligence officer said harshly. "Speak now, or I hand over to the firing squad. All I ask is the name of this wounded man. Remember this, Sergeant. If he is so badly wounded that it was essential to get a doctor to him at such a distance from your own lines, his chance of getting back is nil. You are going to sacrifice 2 of your comrades or nothing at all." I have nothing to say. Only Ted Harris knew how hard it was for him to get out those 5 words. He had fought side by side with China Brown and Curly Bates. They had shivered and starved in Norway. They had dropped out of the night sky over occupied France to help blow in a vital tunnel. They had slid through the deadly waters between occupied Denmark and the coastlines of Norway and Sweden to strike a blow at the rocket base of Peenemünde. And they had lived to earn the name of the Fighting Four. They were like brothers. Even if the 3 privates did pretend to scoff at their sergeant, and even if Ted did tongue-lash them now and then for calling him Ted instead of Sarge. Now, by refusing to give away the identity of Major Corey, he was signing their death warrants. The German officer snapped out a command to the officer in charge of the firing squad. A moment later there was another command, which brought the men to a heel-clicking attention, with rifle butts thumping the tarmac. Another command, and the rifles went up. Bolts were drawn back and pressed home again. There was a live round in each rifle breech. The officer's hand went up. When it fell, 6 forefingers crooked around 6 triggers would tighten. 6 rifle muzzles would spit a little smoke, and China Brown would be dead. Hard-bitten soldier though he was, Ted Harris had to close his eyes. He knew China was looking at him. There was a dead silence, broken by China calling, "So long, Sarge. So long, Curly. See you later." The officer had been on the point of dropping his hand when China spoke. He stiffened, looked at the intelligence officer, who gave him a little curt nod, and at that moment the airfield loudspeaker system came to life with a click, and then a greatly amplified voice called, "Achung! Achung!" The hand which was about to fall and give the signal for the firing party to blast China Brown off this earth remained aloft. The loudspeaker remained mute for perhaps 10 seconds, probably to make sure everyone was listening. Then a name was called, and after this had been repeated, came an order for the man to report to the airfield commandant's office at once. The German intelligence officer had started to turn when the name was mentioned, for it was his name. Then, as the loudspeaker system was switched off with a loud click, the officer in charge of the firing party, his arm still aloft, called to ask for instructions. "Wait, I shall not be long." Ted, China and Curly were not sure what was going to happen until the 6 Germans lowered their rifles after carefully ejecting the live rounds and returning them to their magazines. "All part of the treatment, Sarge," China called out, and he managed a semblance of a grin. But his face was damp with sweat. He had, he knew, been very near to execution. Ted mopped his forehead, which was also covered with a fine beading of perspiration. It was mental torture to stand there, waiting, feeling certain that when the hard-faced intelligence officer returned, the ghastly business would begin all over again. In 10 minutes an airman came running. He saluted the officer in charge of the firing squad, and to the relief of the 3 prisoners, they were lined up, the paper discs taken off the shirts of Curly and China, and all 3 were marched round to the camp commandant's office. They were lined up before the desk, and then into the room came the Italian doctor. He was limping, and far less spruce than he had been when the trio had last seen him. He was unshaven, he had a black eye, and the uniform, which had been trim enough, now looked as if it had been dragged through a very coarse, strong thicket hedge. "Good afternoon," he said, when he had eased himself into a chair by the side of the airfield commandant. "I think I arrived just in time, eh?" "All right, Sergeant Harris, you need not look so wooden-faced. I mean, I came with the name of Major Corey, in time to stop this unpleasant business." It was necessary, the intelligence officer, who had just walked into the room, barked the words out. "We are fighting a war, which I sometimes think the Italian army does not." A curt word from the airfield commandant stopped the angry words. "I want to say," the Italian doctor said pleasantly, "that I am glad I did arrive in time. I thought also that you would like to know that the operation on Major Corey was completely successful." Ted gave a little stiff bow, before saying, I am grateful for your kindness, sir, in telling me this. I am very fond of the Major. You will meet him again very shortly, the intelligence officer sneered. I have just ordered a motorised detachment to round him up. The doctor here has been able to show me on the map the exact position where the Major and the man with him were left. It seems our troops made a mistake in not combing the wadi the night you were captured. Private Foster, the Italian said, lifting a hand to his blackened eye, is a very useful person with his fists. After the operation was completed, I decided that I ought to report the fact that the famous Major Corey was within reach of our intelligence people. He stroked his shiner again and smiled. I had a gun, your Private Foster was unarmed, but either he thinks bullets will not touch him or he is a very brave man. I do not know how I missed shooting him, but I did. I managed to get away, with minor injuries. Is he? Ted asked. He is alive, the Italian said, smiling again. I had to use the butt of my gun, but he would not become unconscious long. I do not know if you were responsible for his training, Sergeant, but he is a very tough man, and... Are we to listen to this drivel for much longer? The intelligence officer asked angrily. Herr Commandant, these men should be put in a safe place. They are part of the Major's gang of cutthroats. They are dangerous. As for you, Doctor, and there was a sneer in the German's voice, I congratulate you on your good luck. To have escaped from the clutches of Major Corey and his men is something quite out of the ordinary. To be responsible for his capture might even mean a decoration from the Führer himself. Herr Hitler does not like Major Corey. He... At that moment the door opened. In response to the pressing of a bell push, an escort had arrived to take the three Britishers away. Not until they were once more under lock and key did they silently shake hands. I'm pretty sure now that I'm going to live to a ripe old age, China mused. Overripe, you mean? Curly chuckled. I've never lived so long in such a short time as when I was waiting for that bloke to drop his hand. The sweat was fair trickling down my back. I'm sorry I had to put you on the spot like that, Ted said quietly. The point is, if the Major is captured, there's a lot of important information going to be lost. All the dope we get together in the desert, the tracks suitable for motorised infantry, the hidden wells, I had to weigh all of that against us three. I was hoping against hope that Sam might get the Major back to base. It would have been an amazing feat if he had managed it. Anyway, I'm sorry for getting you where you were, lads. I wish they'd put me up against the wall first. Do you think I did right? Two pairs of eyes turned on him, then turned away, while China and Curry looked at each other. It was China who, in pretended awe, said, Am I hearing things, Curly? Or did our Ted say, Do you think I did right? If he did say it, then he's weakening in his old age. Having said that, China thrust out his right hand. You did right, Sarge. But don't do it again. My old blood pumper won't stand too many shocks. I'll be dying of a weak heart if I'm not careful. In that case, it isn't any use me saying that I think we ought to get out of here, right now, is it? Ted asked, and now there was an old briskness back in his voice. If you can get us out now, Sarge, Curly said, I'll let you have my chocolate ration for the next 6 months. You're joking, of course. I'm not. Can you hear what I hear? And now Ted had to raise his voice. The air was filled with the throbbing of aircraft engines, and it seemed fairly obvious that a number of planes were circling the landing field, probably waiting permission to touch down. By peering along the length of the window, they were able to see that several Junkers 52 planes were circling overhead, and China saw one come in to land. It taxied off the runway, and at once troops began to disembark. Cor, look at them, China said, a gurgle of glee in his voice. They look as if they've come straight out of the tailor's shop, all brand new, like toy soldiers out of a box at Christmas time. Reinforcements from Germany, I'll bet, Ted commented. Anyway, while all this bustle is going on, we're going to try and scoot. We'll never get a better chance. Look, Curly, lie down on the floor. Pretend you're having a fit or something. Can you foam at the mouth? Nay, Sarge, you're the one who foams at the mouth, Curly protested. But he lay down a yard from the door and began to writhe and heave. He somehow did manage to get some bubbles of saliva about his lips. Ted began to bang on the door, at the same time calling, Hi, guard, open up! Quick! I think one of our chaps is dying or something. Come on, open up! There was no immediate response, for the guard was standing near the outer door, watching the scene of bustle and controlled confusion outside. Then as Ted yelled even louder and banged more heavily on the door, the guard did come back to demand angrily that the prisoners make less noise. Instead of less noise, Ted and China yelled even louder, and the guard called a second man to stand by while he unlocked the door. The door only opened halfway, for Curly was lying there wriggling and heaving, while China knelt by his side. "What is it?" the guard demanded, lowering his rifle. "Get some water or something," Ted snapped, "before it's too late." "Yeah, yeah." The German turned and handed his rifle to the second man, who was also peering in. It was the moment Sergeant Ted Harris was waiting for. He sprang like a tiger, banging the two Germans together. China, who had also been taut-muscled, shot forward and jerked at the legs of the nearest German. A moment later the two Germans were down in a heap with Ted on top of them. China was now aided by Curly, and the two men grabbed at booted feet. They knew Ted was only wearing the thin chapleys, so boots must belong to guards. There was a scuffle, and then with the two guards safely inside, the door was slammed shut. China had a German rifle, and with this he menaced the breathless and rather bewildered guards. All 5 men were panting, and all 5 were listening. The 3 Britishers waited for the angry hammering on the door and a bellowed command to open up, which would tell them that even in the noise and confusion going on outside, the fracas had not gone unobserved. The German guards were also hoping for the same thing. A minute ticked by, and no one came. Outside, the roar of Junkers 52 engines seemed to be increasing, as if the pilots above were in a desperate hurry to touch down and disembark their load of soldiers. "Tie him and gag him," Ted snapped, "and no granny knots. We've got to get at least half an hour's grace before these boys get free, or we've had it in a big way." He stood behind the unlocked door, rifle at the ready. China and Curly had no rope, but they managed with strips of material torn from the khaki shirts of their captains. They used the same material for gags. Then they took the boots of the guards and their Africa Corps caps. "Now we march out of here, with me in between, as a prisoner," Ted said, and now there was the semblance of a smile on his face. "If it comes off, it'll be about the cheekiest thing that's ever happened. If it doesn't come off, well, the least that'll happen will be a POW cage in Italy or Germany. Ready?" China, red-faced with bending, tied the last bootlace, then adjusting the Africa Corps hat at a slightly rakish angle, he took the second rifle. The trio took a last quick look around their prison, then Curly swung open the door and strutted out. Within 30 seconds they were striding past a lounging sentry at the door, who hardly looked at them. He was watching another big Junkers 52 come down, so close on the tail of the one which had just landed that a collision was avoided by inches only. The 3 Britishers were blessing the arrival of reinforcements. The newcomers from across the Mediterranean were being assembled in squads, and there was a constant bellowing of orders as NCOs tried to get the men and the kits off the runways to make way for the other planes still circling overhead. Curly led the way across the front of the airfield buildings, and they must have looked natural enough. 2 German soldiers marching a British sergeant away, for no one gave them more than a first glance. Curly had his eyes on a vehicle parked halfway between the administrative buildings and the coast road. They had to have a car or a lorry to make good their escape before the present confusion died away. Once the Junkers 52 had been dealt with and some order restored, there was every chance that the 2 missing guards would be discovered. Then the hunt would be up. Mechanics servicing vehicles in the car park were taking the chance of arrest and were watching the heavily laden transports come in with almost clockwork precision. Those in command of the reinforcements knew there was always the likelihood of a British fighter or 2 coming along, and transports would be sitting ducks to a fighter pilot. The orders were to get the Junkers unloaded as quickly as possible and on their way back to Italy with the least possible delay. No one took the slightest notice of what had appeared to be an armed escort taking a British prisoner somewhere. 1 or 2 mechanics in the transport park waved and shouted, but the uproar in the airfield was so continuous that when Curly merely waved back, no one thought anything of it. "That's one thing wrong with the British Army, Sarge," Curly muttered, half turning to Ted marching along behind him. "They should teach you the enemy lingo. Makes you feel so unsociable when the Jerrys are saying, 'Hiya pal, how's things?' and you can't answer back." Ted did not reply. His eyes were searching for the most likely vehicle. It had to be big enough to need a large petrol tank. The tank had to be full, and the tyres had to be the wide kind, so necessary for desert travel. What was more, there must be a mechanic on the vehicle, so as to save time getting it in motion. They could not afford the time to rip out the ignition wires and paste them behind the dashboard. They must have an ignition key, and that the mechanic would possess. The next lorry, Ted called, and Curly nodded. He too had noticed that the mechanic on the next 30 CWT lorry was standing by the cab, wiping his hands on a piece of cotton waste. Though the Germans did not know it, he was unlucky to have just finished work on that lorry. It left him in the ideal spot for being held up. The German said something as Curly drew near, and a moment later was attempting to push the Britisher's rifle barrel out of his chest, at the same time swearing at what he thought was a silly joke. "Speak English," and it was Ted asking the question. He still stood between China and Curly, and even from a short distance it must have looked as if the escort and prisoner were merely pausing to have a word with the German mechanic. That question, however, made the German's eyes open wide. His lower jaw dropped. In that instant he realised he was dealing with escaping prisoners. A shout would have brought other mechanics running, but it would also have meant his own death. It did not need more than a glance at the grim-faced trio to tell him that he was dealing with three desperate men. He gulped again, then shook his head. He understood the word English, but that was about the extent of his knowledge of the language. Curly jerked a thumb towards the cab, and when the German hesitated, the gun muzzle lifted a foot until it was touching his throat. Even though he was tanned by the sun, the German lost colour. He nodded in a mechanical kind of way, turned and climbed into the cab. Curly followed him, leaving China to jerk his rifle at Ted as if ordering him into the back of the lorry. There was a rap on the back of the cab a few moments later, the signal that Ted and China were safely in. Curly, sitting as far from the German mechanic as possible so that he could keep the muzzle of his rifle in the man's side, indicated with a jerk of his thumb that the engine should be started. The mechanic produced an ignition key. The red light came on, and a moment later the starter was grinding away as it turned the engine over. Curly shot a quick glance at the dials on the dashboard, trying to decide whether the lorry's petrol tank was full or not. There was a dial giving the oil pressure, another showing that the battery was charging, and another showing the fuel supply. The tank was full. Slowly the lorry drew out of the rank. They had to cross the runway at the coastal road end of the airfield to get out through the gate, and Junkers 52 were coming in still. All other activity on the field had ceased. "What do you think, Sarge?" Curly yelled to Ted in the back. "We'll stand out like a sore finger if we try and get out now. Should we wait until the planes have all come in? There's only another 3. "We've got to get out now," Ted yelled back. "Don't forget, there's a bunch of Jerrys already on their way to collect the Major and Sam. Listen, I'll send China for your driver. You'd better take the wheel." The lorry was stopped. China came round and escorted the driver to the back. This was done on the airstrip side of the lorry, so the action was unseen by the mechanics in the car park, even if any of them had been watching. There came a rattle on the back of the cab, announcing the arrival of the mechanic. Then Curly let in his clutch. The Junkers was coming in to land from the sea. Its propellers were flickering as the engine speed was cut. The machines were coming in low over the perimeter wire so they could have the maximum amount of runway in which to land, without the risk of hitting any of the other Junkers which had landed earlier. "Well, Curly, I hope the fortune teller was right when she said you'd live to a ripe old age," the bald-headed Yorkshireman murmured, as he got his foot well over the accelerator pedal and depressed it down and down. "There's going to be Hawks and Himmels and other German cuss words in a minute, and maybe some shooting." As he steered the lorry towards the gates and onto the tarmac, someone hurried out from the vicinity of the guard hut at the gate and began waving to him to go back. The air was filled with the thunder of aircraft engines as the Junkers 52 came in, losing height rapidly. She would come over the perimeter wire with less than 10 feet to spare, and would then drop even more quickly. There was a risk she might strike the top of the lorry with her landing wheels. Curly's eyes were drawn to mere slits as he stared ahead. He could see the plane, he could see the guards at the gate, all out now, some waving and shouting, some just standing in amazement. The thunder of engines had become a deafening bellow. Curly lifted his eyes for a moment, and a shiver went through him. He seemed to be heading straight for the Junkers 52, and she looked enormous. "Hope he can see me," Curly murmured, and a moment later closed his eyes as the plane cut off the sun from him. He cringed, and in cringing his foot went down even harder on the accelerator. He felt something touch the lorry, for the vehicle gave a jerk, as if a giant had grabbed the back. Then they were moving forward again. and straight ahead was a German waving for him to stop. Behind the man was another, a rifle in his hands. The rifle went up, and Curly knew he was the target. If he stopped, they were finished. If he did not stop, the German would not miss him. Curly lifted his foot from the accelerator and clapped it down hard on the brake pedal.